is that everything is a system of interaction. Um, there are some distinctions between you and your environment, but they're not absolute distinctions. Um, and so, you know, how do we tell you from your environment? Well, based on what kind of interactions back and forth you might have, and in the fact that I can think of you as an individual in various environments, and this individuation is works out. I can make decent guesses about behavior and explain behavior I've seen to me this way, so they just work out. And I'm just saying that if you find the same situation in your own mind uh, with different inclinations, really having their own goals, which can be in conflict with goals of other parts of yourself. You know, maybe you want to travel, but you also want to create a family, and you have to decide, well, am I going to travel or am I going to settle down and create this family? You have to decide that, okay? And the comparisons that you make, I mean, often you might want to think of these as personalities with their own goals and priorities, and then you are going to be this self that union that you know that makes a union of these others, and you'll weigh these back and forth and go with one or the other, or perhaps go with neither and forever be indecisive. And so it's these interactions and the fact that we have these interactions that I'm using to define this, and why I'm not looking for substances, why I don't have to worry about considering an emergent behavior as something you don't see before. You know, it emerges from the arrangements of parts. Well, fine, yeah, the whole includes the arrangements of the parts. So nothing is added there emerging per se. I mean, yes, there's emergent behavior because the behavior isn't shown before the parts are all put together. But the ability to create that behavior didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't an extra part that, oh, we've got all these parts and they're in arrangement, now I'll add the arrangement. No, they're always in some arrangement. And when they're in a particular whole, they'll have a particular arrangement, and that's a part of their characteristics. Okay, and you'll never have a thing, you're just looking for these interactions and behaviors. And I think that parts of our mind interact with other parts of our mind as if in a conversation, as if two personalities debating what to do with their own points of view. With the one side of the coin felt very ardently, and the other side of the coin felt very ardently, possibly, and the debate being very sincere. It's not like there's really one opinion that the whole wants. It's negotiated by a conversation of these parts. And I like to use the example of standard emotions that we know, like anger and lust, and call about those moods, because I think that helps illustrate what I'm saying. But I have to say, in reality, I don't think they're purely angry. You know, I think it's more like by your interests, you know, and by the conditions that you recognized in your life. You know, let's say you're a very simple-minded person. You've recognized in your life, you know, a dangerous condition and a relaxing condition. Well, then those are likely what you're going to have your subpersonalities around. In a dangerous situation, it probably is going to use a lot of anger and fear, and you know it's going to be a recipe of emotions, as is this other thing. Now, I think to a rough approximation, using things like anger makes sense because we have these genetic predispositions to anger, and we develop a bunch of behavior about that. We see where we apply that personality, and so to a first order, you can think of it that way. But someone's anger, when they're feeling angry, some people do remember their compassion, and so their anger mood is not like pure, unadulterated anger of a biological sense. It's an angry mood that brings in a certain amount of compassion. You know, my angry mood involves, okay, I don't always think that great when I'm angry. I don't think about the future. Remember in the future, for example, remember you might not be as mad at this person in the future as you are right now. You know, and that's a part of my angry mood, but it's not part of my biological pure anger. Okay, so I don't want to confuse anybody. But we have to keep these kinds of variables in mind. It's not to be vague. It's because, as I said, we have a lot of free will in how we posit the wills, and we have pragmatic criteria that we use to judge those posits and the value of them. Somebody in comments brought up, no, it's not separated by emotions. It's separated by conscious and unconscious. Well, I use conscious and unconscious as a distinction all the time, and I agree. But that's useful in one case. Basically, when we're trying to explain to ourselves behavior that we can't explain. We don't remember consciously feeling angry at a person, but we act on anger and we say, our anger was unconscious and it generated these feelings that we acted on. That's a separate question. So that's valuable. We can do that. It's orthogonal to splitting it out into something more akin to moods and analyzing each of those moods, in which case we find a different thing. Oh, that I have a different impulses, that I have one impulse towards this kind of situation and result as opposed to this situation result, and they have to negotiate that, and they act somewhat as individual selves in that negotiation, which is why I use that. If we want to talk about our inherent what materially makes the most sense, like in a physical breakdown of the self, then we're going to end up talking neurology. We're going to end up talking about how neurons, and we won't talk philosophy at all. So we are going to use metaphors in this in-between realm between neurology, breaking things down into the distributed system we know it is neurologically, and the self and consciousness as we experience it. If we're going to talk about things in this space in between where we don't sense our brain as a neurological activity directly, we've noticed that with our senses. If we're going to look at things at how we sense them, we're going to break them down into various metaphors and ideas, right? And there's some flexibility in how we do that. And if we want to get some indication from the neurological truths, though, we'll notice, it's a heavily distributed system. So I think it makes sense that we find ourselves able to break our sense of self, or sense of our personality, into sub-selves and sub-personalities. That's not surprising, because it's a highly distributed system. I'm not surprised that metaphors that rely on the idea of distribution of responsibilities, even responsibilities like having a personality, I'm not surprised that those end up being distributed systems. So I find that they correlate loosely in that sense. But I'm not trying to derive one of these senses of self from any particular organ in the brain, but a neurologist might, and I would value that, and I would value any number of systems that you might have for breaking down personality of various types. The personality tests that categorize your personality, I think those are valid and interesting, and we can compare them all together and slowly get one we really like, and maybe that'll eventually merge with the neurological view. Fine. But in the meanwhile, it doesn't have to, because what it really has to do is help us figure out what's going on around us. And I think breaking down personalities into the subpersonalities, where the subpersonalities are their major independent goals and moods and contexts that they recognize, where they start a particular type of reaction to the context they think they're in. I think all of these are useful to do as we go along. And if they ever converge, great. But if they don't in the meanwhile, as I say, we just have to explain what's going on around us. And I think we can. I mean, the anger example holds because of that. It is of value to think to yourself, how does this person act when they're angry? And then when they're angry, realize that. And a lot of people do that. It's like, well, when they're angry, you come by for a visit and they're angry, leave. And if you come by for a visit and they're not angry, hey, hang out. And we're making judgments based on their behavior, based on a subset of their mood behavior and a subset of their behavior. And when we see a little bit of that subset, we say, okay, look, we're in a situation where the full sphere of this behavior is this angry self I don't want to deal with. And if we see a different set of behavior, we treat the person totally differently, and we hang out and we have a different experience with them. And that works, so that's valuable enough. And how fundamental is it? Well, I think it's going to turn out fairly fundamental. Not necessarily into the subpersonalities I identify, because we're just thinking and brainstorming about it. But in general, that you have subpersonalities, I think is very likely to turn out to be a valid way to look at things, because we have this highly distributed system. So I imagine the logic, the metaphor, everything is going to be on a distributed basis, where the collation does not happen because of some big central single entity that is itself and sameness and reacts the same way, but really on the interplay between all these things. And I'm emphasizing the interplay by saying this. By saying, oh, there's no single self, that it's really always interplay of parts, I'm forcing us to look at the interplay. It's not just about, oh, I've identified an angry self and I forget about the others. No, I have the angry self and all these other selves, and the conversation that they're having, the interactions that they're having, that's the point. That's what bringing this up tries to to get into and analyze. So, yes, it's about interactions. Cheers.